Well, the judge of MasterChef, ex-judge of MasterChef, is going to be suing the BBC after his sacking. This is Gregg Wallace, who, of course, was booted from the show after complaints came in over his behaviour, particularly that towards women. He's turning around and saying, get this, that actually it's down to neurodiversity. He was formally diagnosed with autism. He's put in a statement. My neurodiversity, now formally diagnosed as autism, was suspected and discussed by colleagues across countless seasons of MasterChef, yet nothing was done to investigate my disability or protect me from what I now realise was a dangerous environment for over 20 years. So he is taking the BBC to High Court. Let's speak now to Rebecca Ryan, who's a campaign director of Defund the BBC. It's an interesting case, isn't it, Rebecca? Because some of the reports that came out about Gregg Wallace's behaviour, you kind of think, well, you can't do that in a workplace. That's probably not on. And he's the one saying, actually, it was a dangerous workplace for me because I'm neurodiverse. I mean, the BBC are going to be tied in knots by this.
Absolutely. They don't know which box they're meant to be ticking on this. Who's got the biggest grievance? But this is the issue, isn't it? Is that his behaviour was going on for well over a decade. When and if the BBC had an issue with it, they should have dealt with it at the time. And if he's saying, as he's saying there, that they all talked openly about his potential neurodiversity, then why didn't they do something about it at the time? So it'd be interesting to see how it all plays out in the court. But at the end of the day, if they have to give him a massive payout, it'll be the licence fee payer that's stumping up for it.
Right, that's the thing. It's us, we, the people who own television sets, who are going to be on the hook for whatever actually on the hook, for whatever outcome, because we're going to basically probably be paying all the legal costs for this. I think actually, moving away from the BBC, it's a very interesting test case. We've seen it happen in the sort of criminal law sector, where you have people who have committed atrocious crimes, who are then diagnosed with a mental health condition and end up going to a secure hospital rather than prison, or have lesser sentences because of it. And you kind of start to think we end up in the weeds where, when does committing a crime become, well, it wasn't my fault, it was my weird brain?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know about you, but I'm a bit of a true crime fan. And yeah, you often watch these kind of jury verdicts where they're asked to consider whether it's because somebody's got a mental health issue or not. But at the end of the day, surely we've got to draw a line as to what is someone's personal responsibility and what isn't. And at the moment, it seems like more and more behaviour is able to sort of come under this sort of spectrum of mental health conditions.
Yeah, no, I don't. Because the thing is, most of us couldn't really, most of us don't commit crimes. I think most people who do probably are wired a bit differently. That's just a fact. Let's talk now, because Gregg Wallace is one in a series of scandals that have rocked the BBC. Who can forget Hugh Edwards and, of course, that Sir Jimmy Savile, no doubt, always on people's minds. And when quizzed up against a select committee in Parliament yesterday, the BBC boss Tim Davies had to sort of relent and say, well, more stars could be unmasked in abuse of power scandals. I mean, at the end of the day, in all walks of life, in all professions, there are wrong-uns, particularly those people who end up in privileged and powerful positions who seem to think, therefore, they become invincible. And some might argue no one is more privileged or powerful than people who become household names off the back of the state broadcaster.
Absolutely. And that was the thing yesterday in that committee, is that they were sort of squirming there, weren't they, in a sort of desperate attempt to get back to business as usual for the BBC, as kind of, whitewashing away all of these issues. And he was very keen, Tim Davie, not to make any kind of commitment that there wasn't more scandal coming down the line. So it does make you wonder what else he's sitting on. But the thing is, in other organisations, if something comes up, it's dealt with quickly, and everybody understands that, yes, there are wrong-uns, yes, they should be dealt with, and that's okay. But the fact is, the BBC has this sort of history and this pattern of quashing any complaints and promoting people within these sort of jobs and giving them more power and a bigger platform, and then finally sort of 10, 20 years down the line, 30 years down the line, we find out that actually they've known about this behaviour all along. And that's what's really unacceptable for licence fee payers, is that they're being forced to pay these people's salaries when the BBC, had these red flags waving all over the place about them.
I've always thought it comes down to the basic no taxation without representation, and the licence fee is a essentially a tax on owning a television. And I've always thought that what we should have, if we're going to keep any sort of a model like that, and there's a big argument, of course, around that, which is a campaign that you very much lead. But you can't just have a sort of BBC taking all this money and not being accountable. At the very least, the Director General should be sort of voted in on based on some sort of manifesto. Now, talking about democracy, it's a favourite trope of the left. They go, why are you giving Nigel Farage so much airtime? Oh, it's not fair. He gets so much airtime. And they're at it again. Liz Jarvis, the Lib Dem MP for Eastleigh, asked why the BBC gave reform wall-to-wall coverage when it only has 4 MPs. They replied, we are aware that the political system and the electorate are fragmenting. BBC News coverage reflects not just party representation in Parliament, but also what polling is telling us about how many people support one party. Do you want to know a funny little secret, a little fact, Rebecca? Okay. It was me who actually made the BBC Trust rewrite all of their rules when I was head of media for UKIP, and I argued, because they only based it on domestic elections, the most recent domestic election, i.e. they didn't involve European Parliament elections, and they didn't look at polling. And I kept making the case as head of media for UKIP back in the day, in 2013. Actually, you're doing a disservice to the general public when you look at polling and how many people actually want to hear from UKIP who are going to be voting for them. And I had to produce all this evidence. We had a series of meetings, and I was the one who changed the rules. There you go.
Excellent, well done. I mean, I think the thing is, and you know, the BBC are correct to say that absolutely they should be giving representation, and they are obliged to give representation to reform supporters, because that's in the Royal Charter, that, you know, that they are supposed to represent all parts of the UK. And what's interesting is that there's a Lib Dem MP there who is upset about it because they've only got 4 MPs, when it's the Lib Dems who gamed the system by sort of picking out those sort of constituencies in order to get a huge amount of MPs with very little national support. So, you know, she should perhaps, you know, think.
Well, it also makes me laugh that a Lib Dem MP is complaining about Nigel Farage having wall-to-wall coverage when their election strategy was constantly to stick their lead on some sort of body of water, be he larking around in a Lido or on a jet ski looking like an absolute muppet. You know, they had to essentially build a physical moat around the man so nobody could ask him questions. He turned basically democracy into Takeshi's Castle. I think it's unforgivable. But it's interesting, isn't it? You know, the BBC being cross-examined, and yet they talk about needing to politically give Reform Voices a platform, that this is a big news story and all the rest of it. Absolutely right. They still don't seem to understand that they also have to represent the views of the 30% of British people plus who actually are quite drawn to reform. That isn't about just putting the odd politician on a programme. That's about stopping turning everything into the woke games.
Absolutely, and that's the thing that we saw earlier on this week, didn't we, where the BBC put up a post, which they did actually remove fairly quickly, where they called the use of against the sort of illegal immigration boats, they called it racist in the headline of this post, and it shows that clearly they are not representing the views of a huge amount of the population that is supporting reform, as we've seen in poll after poll. I think it was over 100 polls now. The most recent polls have said that reform are in the lead. And so the BBC needs to do far better, as you say. It's not just about, you know, box ticking and getting a representative on from reform to talk in things, but also in their coverage. And that's what they find really difficult, because they have this groupthink within the organisation, and they have this culture of sort of metropolitan elitism, and they just can't identify with, you know, the average reform supporter.
Do you know, I would love it if the BBC were to conduct some sort of an anonymous survey of all of its staff and basically ask them for their attitudes on certain big topics and their political leanings. So it doesn't identify an individual, but what you get back is some sort of pie chart of where on the political spectrum everyone who works there is. And I would imagine it would be like a photo negative of the rest of the country.
Absolutely. I think we can be pretty safe that that's what the average BBC employee feels like. And that's why they sort of feel so cushioned and safe in their opinions. And that's why these things slip out all the time, why they accidentally make a documentary about Hamas using one of the Hamas leaders' children to do the narrative, you know, and it's just, it's so alien to them because within the M25 and the dinner party set, they're very, very used to hearing their opinions bounce back to them all the time, and they have no idea of what's going on in the rest of the country.
Oh, Rebecca, it's always brilliant catching up with you. Keep up the good work. Rebecca Ryan there, Campaign Director of Defund the BBC. Should we take a